Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about your man Euripides. Euripides is the third of the three great Athenian tragic playwrights whose work survives to this day, along with Aeschylus and Sophocles. I say Euripides is the third because he's generally thought of as kind of the latest of these three playwrights to hit his sort of peak career period. Euripides was born around 484 BCE. He died around 407. And he had a fairly tumultuous life, I think. But in terms of his playwriting style, he was definitely controversial. There's a lot of different reads of Euripides today, a lot of different ways that people look at this playwright and sort of try and give us a whole picture of him. So some people argue that he was a much more modern playwright than Aeschylus or Sophocles. Modern with a capital M in this case, as in embracing the values of modernity. In some ways, I think that's true. In other ways, I think that's very much a romanticization of Euripides. He's often regarded as the least patriotic of the three. Aeschylus is often seen as the most sort of gung-ho, rah-rah Athens. And Euripides is seen as the least. He's seen as the one who is most willing to be critical of Athens. And I think this is in part because of plays like The Trojan Women, in which Euripides paints a very negative picture of the Greeks. If we stack this up against a play like Aeschylus's Persians, which is another play set in a foreign land, the Persians there are very clearly problematized. So while they are the protagonists of that play, their autocratic rulership is seen as a bad thing in contrast to Athenian democracy or Greek democracy. Whereas in something like The Trojan Women, the Trojans, the women who have survived the fall of Troy and are now being enslaved by the Greeks, are very much the admirable characters, whereas the Greek heroes, the characters that we might know from the Iliad, for instance, these people are very, very negatively portrayed. So I think that's part of the reason people often think that Euripides is more willing to be critical of the Athenian establishment. Euripides also has some fairly lengthy debates about democracy, which was, of course, a cornerstone of Athenian culture in the 5th century BCE. For instance, I think it's The Phoenician Women, there's a whole section where no, not The Phoenician Women, The Suppliant Women, sorry. In Aeschylus's Suppliant Women, there's a whole section where Theseus and a herald from Thebes are debating democracy. And Theseus is making these sort of traditional defenses of democracy as about freedom and about sort of maximizing the individual's capacity to contribute to society, whereas the herald is making these very standard, traditional, anti-democratic arguments that Athenians would have been familiar with in the 5th century BCE, because there were critics of democracy. It was a major, major point of contention in 5th century Greece as a whole, the Greek-speaking world. I mean, even beyond what is today Greece, throughout Grecian colonies in Italy, in North Africa, along the Black Sea, wherever it was, the conflict between democracy and oligarchy, monarchy, whatever it was an extremely important debate, kind of underpinning much of the Peloponnesian War. So when we have what we have in Euripides, in terms of his stance on democracy, I think is much more complicated than people sometimes give it credit for. I think it's also much more complicated than what we get in people like Aeschylus, and Sophocles to a lesser extent, although Sophocles, I think, is less interested in democracy as such. But because Euripides gives us these much more fleshed out critiques of democracy, I think people often see him as more skeptical, more willing to question Athenian values. But it's usually the heroes of the play, it's usually the admirable characters, the protagonists, who are making the defenses of democracy. And so I think that's worth noting as well. I think he fundamentally is a democratic playwright. I mean, because we know, like, Aristophanes is an anti-democratic playwright. Aristophanes barely conceals his disdain for the idea of democracy in many of his comedies. Things like Lysistrata, Thesmophoria Zeussae, not Thesmophoria Zeussae, Ecclesia Zeussae. These kinds of plays, The Wasps is another one, in which Aristophanes is just very, very disdainful of democracy. But with Euripides, I don't get that. I get the sense that he wants to engage with the critiques of democracy, maybe out of a sense that democracy can be made better, out of a sense that if you can overcome these critiques, democracy can be improved. But fundamentally, I get the sense that he is pro-democratic. Another thing that people often talk about with Euripides is his penchant for staging disenfranchised people. Groups of women as the choruses are very, very common in Euripides' play. The Trojan women, obviously, is one. The Phoenician women is another. The suppliants is another. We just get a ton of them. Medea is another, in which we have a chorus of women. This is very, very common. It's not uncommon necessarily in Aeschylus and Sophocles, but it's more prominent, I think, in Euripides per capita in terms of number of plays. Bearing in mind, of course, that we only have a tiny fragment of any of these playwrights' original work, but of what we have, the female chorus is much more common in Euripides than it is in the other two playwrights. We also have a lot more instances, again, sort of per capita, in which Euripides puts a female character or a foreigner or both at the forefront of his plays, in which these female characters or foreigners who, again, were in a sort of problematic category in 5th century BCE Athens. Resident foreigners were called metics. This was a separate category of people, and they didn't really have political rights. They had a certain degree of protection in the city, in the polis, but they didn't have political rights. People like Medea are definitely in that category, and in that play, even though Medea is an extremely problematic protagonist, and she's not clearly a hero in the way that some other tragic protagonists are meant to be, Medea is without doubt the protagonist and the driving force of the play that bears her name. There's a lot of anti-feminist stuff in Euripides' plays, often coming from the chorus, sometimes coming from major male characters who will be like, women can't keep secrets, or, oh, women don't have any wisdom that's useful, so we shouldn't listen to them. Or in Orestes, he kind of makes the argument, all women would kill their husbands if they knew they could get away with it just by appealing to their son's pity. So it's right that I murdered my mother. So we get these kind of anti-feminist things here, and it's hard to tell, for me at least, where Euripides stands on that. Because obviously he's chosen to write these things. He's chosen to write these things that are fairly scathing toward women, but at the same time, Euripides is staging these very positive female characters, very strong female characters, matriarchs, queens of cities, princesses, but also just very strong figures. Again, Medea probably being the archetypal one, who's not royal per se, but like Hecuba in the Trojan Women. This is another figure who is very, very strong and an extremely well-written part. So from a dramatic perspective, from that sort of question of how good a part is this somebody who would be good to play, exciting to play, offers dramatic possibilities, Euripides' women very often do fit into that category. Even in some of the plays that aren't quite as good, like Orestes, Euripides' Electra is a very strong character. She contributes to the plot that's meant to save her life, her brother's life, and Pylades' life. She comes up with part of that plan. So the fact that women are active and participating and contributing in Euripides, I think does support the idea that Euripides is more willing to give voice to characters who wouldn't have had political voices in 5th century BCE Athenian democracy. Again, primarily women and foreigners, but also slaves. There are slave characters in Euripides' plays. They're usually more minor characters, like the slave in Orestes who escapes when Orestes and Pylades are going to kill Helen. The slave who escapes out into the courtyard and talks to the chorus for a while and then persuades Orestes not to kill him. It's a good part. I mean, he's not a strong character, a brave, heroic, noble character, but he's a good part. He's funny and he's insightful and he makes interesting arguments about life and death and justice. So I definitely agree with that kind of assessment, that Euripides is interested in the experiences of people who would normally be outside the political order of 5th century BCE Athens. And he puts these people on stage and he gives them interesting, important, insightful things to say, which I think is really significant in terms of, not necessarily at the time, because we know this didn't happen, but today this can be a good model for expanding the scope of democracy. Because, I mean, today with liberal representative democracies, we tend to have a very wide franchise. And that's kind of ethically aligned with Euripides' kind of project of bringing in the voices of women, bringing in the voices of foreigners, bringing in the voices of slaves who otherwise might not have had any kind of representation in Athenian democracy. So I think that's kind of the thing that I find most interesting about Euripides, is he has ultimately these complicated relationships with all of the things that he's generally regarded as famous for. He has a complicated relationship to democracy. He has a complicated relationship to women and foreigners, to those who are unrepresented in the democracy. He has a complicated relationship to Athens. But that's what makes his plays so very fascinating, is that complexity.